Yeah, that was a fun sector to hack. I'll say that much. But yeah, so this is where a lot of my experience has lied. So here's just a quick snapshot of what we're going to be talking about today. We'll be going through a beginner's, intermediate, and advanced methodology. And we'll talk about some of the barriers to improving your methodology and overcoming those barriers to improving your methodology. You're going to hear me say the word methodology probably 100 times today. So methodology, what is methodology, right? So methodology is simply a way of doing, right? So if it's simply a way of doing, it is simply a way of pen testing. I put an example of the P-test methodology up here that I'm sure at least most pen testers are very familiar with, and is used, quite a bit. So this is an example of how someone using the P-test methodology goes about pen testing for a client, right? Now, when I was writing this talk, I wanted to really think about the critical areas within my experience where I feel like I really had to shape and mold and improve upon to better my methodology. And that is where these four points that we're going to be talking about throughout this presentation, I feel like these are the most critical areas when we're talking about methodology. So your ability to fully enumerate, your perspective of the attack surface, your exploitation scalability, and your communication and technical writing, right? Now, three things I want to say about this scale. One, this scale is very fluid, right? Two, this scale is subjective because I am basing this off of my own experience over the past few years. And three, your refinement of your methodology is going to be strongly shaped by your technical perspective. And I feel like that's kind of a given, right? Because the more you hack or pen test on an engagement, the more you learn. And with each engagement that I did with the sectors that I've hacked in, I've learned something new along the way that's only improved my methodology. So let's jump into beginner's methodology. Now, as we go throughout this presentation, this house right here, you're going to see quite a bit. I'm really big on visuals. Sure, I'm very big on the technical aspects, but I think it's very important that I communicate what expanding your methodology looks like, right? So when we're talking about a beginner's methodology, typically a beginner will learn how to scan, enumerate, exploit. Those basic three things, right? So run an Nmap scan. Oh, it's vulnerable to whatever. Okay, let me enumerate the web application a little bit more. Oh, there's a Metasploit module for it, right? So your ability to fully enumerate, typically when you're looking at, let's say this house analogy, which I'll actually just jump into really quick. So let's just say that a client approaches you and says, hey, I need you to hack everything on my property, find all the vulnerabilities you can before the actual real bad guys do. If you're a beginner, like I said, you might learn about the standard beginner tools like Nmap or Nessus or Nikta or GoBuster. You might only just peek through the windows or knock on the front and the back doors, right? So your perspective of the attack surface as a beginner, you're typically gonna see, I guess, the most obvious parts of the attack surface. When it comes to your exploitation scalability, I was pointing out a Metasploit module. Typically, as a beginner, you're looking at point and click exploits, right? You're not necessarily writing your own exploits. And when it comes from a communication and a technical writing standpoint, your writing typically isn't as in depth. You don't necessarily communicate the risk and impact, which is really the bread and butter that you want to give a client. So this is the view that typically a beginner's methodology looks like. So when we're moving into intermediate methodology, earlier I said that this is subjective, right? The scale is subjective. When I think intermediate, I think to myself anywhere from 2 to 5 years in the field of hacking or anything like that. So typically, because you've been in the field for a little bit longer, your technical perspective expands. Now you know how to run maybe, let's say, more deeper Nmap scans, right? So most people know how to run a simple Nmap scan, but not everyone knows how to run like a zombie or idle scan, or what's another one, like a fragmentation scan with Nmap. So when it comes to your ability to fully enumerate, you're typically starting to check the windows, the doors, the garage, the backyard, and so forth. When it comes to your perspective of the attack surface as an intermediate, skilled person, you can see almost all of the attack surface. You might miss some things here and there, and that's okay. When it comes to your exploitation skill ability, outside of point and click, that's when you start to get deeper into like manual testing. And it really is a little bit more challenging once you reach manual, because you have to have a sort of, you need to have like a certain amount of knowledge to know how to go ahead and start doing manual testing. I've been on plenty of engagements where they're just like, please don't run any scans toward our applications or our network, keep it manual. And it does get more challenging that way. You also start to write more scripts to automate some of your processes more. When it comes to your communication and technical writing ability, typically this is when you start to get a little bit more in depth with the risk and impact that is shown more thoroughly. So let's look at the visual for it, for intermediate methodology. Something you might notice is that I didn't remove the beginner parts of the methodology, right? What you'll notice is with intermediate, I'm building upon. Give me 1 second, let me expand this. Just so you all know, my cat just walked in the room and likes to be held sometimes when I'm on a computer. So yeah, there's that. So again, let me jump back into it. So yeah, you're gonna still stick to some of the beginner things that you learned, right? But now, if you're standing outside of this property that the client wants you to figure out how to get your way in, now you're looking at the shingles on the roof. Maybe you might want to start digging into what might be under there, right? So I put seg hide as a tool. Typically beginners don't necessarily know about that tool. Maybe you, as you're stepping back and you're viewing the property, now you're seeing, oh, there's a shed out back right there. Let me see what is going on in there. What version is that running, right? Let me see how the weather is actually impacting the pointing out earlier, your scans become more targeted and a little bit more advanced, like using fragmentation scans and so forth. 1 second here. Can you still hear me okay? Okay, I'm breaking up. Can anybody hear me? Okay, how about now? Awesome. Okay. So I'll just sort of recap what I was talking about here with the intermediate methodology. So like I was saying before, you're really building upon the skills you've already learned, right? So that's why you don't see this gone like it was on the beginner's methodology page. So now you're checking the roof. You're looking at the shingles on the roof. You're starting to get a little bit more detailed. You're starting to run more targeted scans, more targeted Nmap scans. Again, like fragmentation scan or idle scan or zombie scan, like those are more advanced techniques with Nmap, right? Now, maybe you're looking at how the weather impacts the property or your client's application or your network. Your view is now expanded as an intermediate level pen tester. So when we get into the advanced methodology, I want to say that from my experience, from the people that I've worked with, it seems to be about the 5-year, 6-year, or 7th-year mark where people really start to get like super advanced with pen testing. That's just been my experience. Maybe some people will get there before 5 and 7 years, but from the people I've worked with, that seems to be sort of the sweet spot, right? And something I've learned from them when it comes to their advanced methodology, they are checking the house from top to bottom. They're checking the entire surrounding property. Their perspective of the attack surface, they're really starting to see the entire attack surface. And I put that in quotation marks because there's still 0 days, right? Sometimes there are things there that no matter how skilled you are, you're just not going to see. When it comes to your exploitation skill ability, again, you're building upon what you've learned. So point and click from beginner, you begin more manual testing, more script writing, and now you're starting to do your own exploit development that you can contribute to the community. When it comes to communication and technical writing, this is where it becomes even more in-depth as far as risk and impact analysis. I will say that from a writing standpoint, between intermediate and advanced, is not that much different, but you do start to see a slight difference there, a noticeable one and a more impactful one. So if we're looking at this from an advanced viewpoint, right, let's look at everything we're building upon. So if you see this like guy down here, right, now he's exploring the landscape more deeply, right? Now they're exploring the inside of the house, or maybe they're attempting to speak to the occupants of the house. Now we're just adding on to our already developed methodology. So really what I want to communicate through these different visuals is just how your perspective, like I was saying in the beginning, your perspective, your technical perspective, it shapes everything. And again, it really will impact how good the pen test you are conducting against a client network. It impacts how well and how thorough the test is. So now that we have an understanding of beginners, intermediate, and advanced methodologies, let's talk about some of the barriers to improvement. Now, what you see here on the screen, this is not necessarily new information, right? Everybody knows this. I've been in the field for quite a few years now, and I still have some of these feelings from time to time, depending on what I'm up against, right? But then I have to remind myself, yo, it's emotional, it's not intellectual. Let's jump back into it. So I'm sure most of you have experienced imposter syndrome, that afraid of failure, which could lead to like a ton of anxiety or procrastinating, learning the next thing you need to learn. Perfectionism, this was something I really struggled with. And I eventually had to just like learn to like let it fall apart, and it's okay. And also just your comparison to others. I think this one is probably the most common among people, especially when they get into pen testing, because they're thinking like, man, like they know all these advanced techniques and so forth. But the thing you have to remember is that where someone else is, it has nothing to do with your own path, right? You're really in, I don't even like to call it a race, but you're really only comparing to yourself. That's who you should be comparing yourself to. Compare yourself today to who you were yesterday. Maybe you learned a new tool that you didn't know the day before, and now you know it today. One of my favorite quotes, just based off of just learning and some of my experience from being in education, was the major barrier to skill acquisition, it isn't intellectual, it's actually emotional. And that's why I lay out these 4 here. So I know you're probably thinking like, oh, the barriers are not necessarily technical, because honestly, it's really not. It's not technical, it's more mental, emotional. So now that we understand the barriers to improvement, let's move on to, I guess, oh, I'm so sorry. Hold on. My cat is touching the thing, y'all. So now let's talk about overcoming those barriers. I'm sorry, my cat is going to make a debut. Oh, he's still in the show, y'all. Okay, so overcoming those barriers, right? So the first thing I want to point out is the 10,000 hour thing, right? I feel like this is something that a lot of people have heard of, right? They've done studies. It takes 10,000 hours to become an expert in a particular field. Okay, buddy. It takes 10,000 hours to become an expert in your field, but that really depends on like your dedication and consistency to whatever you're trying to learn. But instead of viewing that, which is a lot to take in, let's break it down to where it actually takes 20 hours to learn something new, right? And you can break that down into even smaller pieces. So I know I'm talking about some of like the emotional pieces, but when we go into some of the technical pieces, it really could be as simple as 40 minutes a day for a month. That's it. It's just taken in smaller bites, right? Now, to look on the outside here, you see I got therapy session, right? I'm all for therapy. And the reason I put this here is because some people do have like crippling anxiety, right? So I always encourage people, if you have crippling anxiety that's not allowing you to like move forward in different parts of your life, especially in your career, it's okay to go to therapy. Like talk to someone, even if you don't want to go to therapy, talk to a friend or talk to someone that you know is in the field that can actually help you along. Maybe they can be your accountability partner or something like that, right? And lastly, when it comes to pen testing, right, you have to commit to learning, like a lifetime of learning for as long as you're going to be in this field, right? But again, because we have this comparison to others, sometimes we think like, oh my God, I'm so behind, I need to like hurry up. You don't have to. Take your time, go at your own pace. But in the middle of doing that and learning all the tools and techniques, self-care is super important. And I'm going to be honest, I learned this the hard way. You know, I got to a point of being really, really burnt out. I was just like, oh my God, like I can't keep studying like this. And it really came down to my self-care. When I'm taking better care of myself, I'm actually able to take in more information. I'm able to retain that information in a more productive manner. So yeah, so if you're looking to learn something new and you're feeling some of these things here, know that you're not alone. Most, if not all of us in this field are feeling that. And you can overcome it, break it down into smaller pieces and talk to someone. And that is the conclusion to refining your offensive pen test methodology. Thank you all for coming to my talk.
All right. Sorry about that. Had to find the mute button.
No worries.
But are there any questions before we log off right now, guys? Any questions at all? Now is your time.
And feel free to reach out on LinkedIn if you have any questions later on, or follow me on Mastodon. I'm on there as well. I'm not on Twitter quite as much anymore, which I'm sure most people know why. But yeah, I do answer to my LinkedIn more frequently.
All right. I'm not seeing any questions. But we will share your LinkedIn information with everyone here so they can reach out to you later. Too. So thank you everyone for coming out, and
so they can reach out to you later.
All of our talks
Too. So thank you for coming out and